In this lesson, I want to talk about the camera's focusing systems. And I'm going to break this down in a very easy to understand way. I need to point out, however, we have a sensor, a camera sensor, that is many times larger than a cell phone camera. Cell phone cameras are tiny, they use very small sensors, and very small recording media has a very deep depth of field. A depth of field is sort of like a wall of focus. It's how much of this invisible wall you're putting out there, the subject matter between it is going to be in focus. And in the case of cell phone cameras, very small sensors have very deep depths of field, so everything's in focus. That's why cell phone cameras are so convenient. You just basically take a picture of something and everything around it's going to be in focus, more or less, right? Not so with larger sensor cameras. Even an APS-C size sensor is 20 to 30 times the size of a cell phone camera. And we have to be very specific about telling the camera where to look when it takes the picture. Because if we're looking in the wrong place, the picture is going to be blurry. So, pure beginners, start off on your program mode. There is this other mode, the green box mode, which I lovingly refer to as the dummy mode. I'm not a fan of it. I'm going to hide this. It wants me to set up the creative modes. The dummy mode pretty much does everything for you. You didn't buy this camera for the dummy mode. So anytime you see that green box, we're going to stay away from that. We're going to be in the P mode. The easiest way for me to break down the focusing systems is if you think of this in terms of the how, the when, and the where. How, when, and where. If you remember those three things, this is going to be easy. So the first part, how does the camera focus? The cameras, most cameras, focus with a halfway shutter button depression. You push the shutter button halfway down, that engages the camera's focusing systems. You push the button down all the way, and it takes the picture. Very straightforward, very easy. Halfway shutter button depression, full depression will take the picture. Now, in the case of the R7, we also have this button on the back, AF on, which means that we can push this button, and this will also engage the camera's focusing system. And when we're ready to take the picture, we would just push it down all the way. Because we're dealing with a touchscreen monitor, we can also touch on the screen if it is set up where we don't have this touch shutter enable, and we can just touch on the screen in different places and the camera will focus. 3 different ways that we can engage the how: shutter button, halfway depression, AF on, and touch monitor. And that is how we engage the camera's focusing system. The second part of this question deals with the camera's focusing modes. The when the camera is focusing. If we come into our Q mode up here, you can see that we have it on one shot. It's currently on one shot right here. One shot autofocus means the camera will focus one time and it will remain in a focus lock as long as the button we're using is held down. So in the case of the shutter button, I can push the shutter button halfway down. It's getting a focus lock. And if I move the camera around, the position of the focal plane will not change. And I can push it down all the way and take the picture. Now, for subjects that are still, this is great if you have a cooperating human, like an adult or even a teenager. For really small kids, it's not a great focusing mode because small kids like to run around out of control and they don't like to listen to what you're telling them. So, one shot is good for still subjects when we need a one-time focus and we take the picture. Now, I want to demonstrate something. We have a small focusing box here. Is that this is very handy if we want to do something called recompose. This is where we can get a focus lock on something and move the camera as I'm holding the shutter button halfway down. This is something that you should practice. I'm focusing on this blind here, and I'm holding the shutter button down as I'm recomposing. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, you may be in the middle of action and you don't want your subject in the middle of the screen. You want to change the composition a little bit. And I pushed so the joystick was over here. I just pushed it into the center and it jumped back to the middle there. So this technique that I'm doing here, and you see we got a tracking box. It's really not even the right box for this. Let's go to a focusing square. Not that either. Let's come up here to an actual focusing point where we have a focusing box that won't move. Same thing, I can still touch with it, but push it in the center. I can get a focus lock and recompose. Doesn't work really well on wide aperture settings like 1.8, 2.8. You really need to be like at f4, f5 if you're shooting a person and recomposing. Shallow depths of field, it doesn't really work, but that's something that every professional photographer knows how to do is they get the focus lock and they recompose. It only works in one shot. So the question that I'm sure you have is, what about sports? Great question. You can come into the Q mode, go to one shot, servo. Servo is focusing over and over and over again. One shot is once, servo is continuous, and it's called continuous in certain camera systems. Now, something I'm sure you noticed is that in one shot when we focus, we get this green frame. See, it's green. And we get a beep. The beep's telling us, hey, you got it in focus, right? Now, if we come in and we go to servo, watch what happens. Now we have a blue box. Not green, blue. In the servo mode is focusing over and over and over again, continuously, as long as we hold that shutter button halfway down, as long as we hold the autofocus on button halfway down. It's not really doing it when we use the touch monitor in the back. You can see it's jumping back to the green box. But these two guys here means that the camera is continually focusing wherever that blue box is. This is what you're going to want to use for sports shooting, fast moving subjects, birds in flight. This is the mode that you want because with moving subjects, the camera has to adjust its focal plane very quickly. So that is the when the camera is focusing, whether it's one time or whether it's many times over and over and over again. Now let's talk about the where the camera is focusing. This deals with the camera's focusing clusters. Now this can be a little confusing about how to get to these boxes. You can always come into the Q menu and you can select the focus AF area. Here they all are on the bottom. And as they go across the bottom, you'll see you get a little indicator, AF spot or spot AF. It's saying that tracking frame is not displayed. That's fine. So I'm going to select the spot focusing square. And that is a very small defined focusing square. So if I'm a macro photographer, maybe I want to go with spot focusing cluster. And I can come back to the cluster. Now we have 1 point autofocus. Hit that. And you can see that the square is a little bit bigger. So a lot of these deal with different sizes, right? I'm going to come back out. Here we have the expand AF area. And you can see it's even a little bit bigger. So it gives a priority to the center box. I'm going to put my finger in here. I'm probably too close. But you can see that even as I get to these points on the outside, it's engaging the servo focusing. Let's keep taking a look here. So you can see expand AF area around, it's an even bigger cluster, right? Let's use this guy right here. Like that. There we go. With a priority in the center and a secondary priority on this outer rim. So a lot of these deal with the size of the box that we're using. Now these next three here, they are the flexible zone 1, 2, and 3. And you'll notice here when it says push the cluster button to change these different options, if we come in here, you can see that we get this vertical zone. This shape is telling the camera to look in here, right? So as long as anything is in that area, the camera can find the contrast and jump to it. That's how the camera is looking. This is why I use white blinds. The camera is looking for an area of contrast within the box that we have selected. It also prioritizes high contrasty things in that box that are closest to you. So obviously if something's closer, it's going to prioritize it. Now, something that's interesting about these is that when we push the cluster button and we rotate the primary selector, you can see that we can adjust the width of this. This is something that I have not seen on a Canon camera before. And if we rotate as well as the height of it, so we can adjust the size of this box to be any size that we want beyond this basically a single square, which is very cool. This is very cool. Canon is giving us permission to change the size of our larger autofocus areas, right? So if you're doing birds in flight and you want a very wide box, look how wide we can get. And we can just have that on our AF zone 1. Or maybe, maybe we're shooting a sport or something in such a way that we want to stick to this horizontal plane. Great. Because when we engage the focusing systems, there it is. It's staying within that plane. So those flexible spot modes, 1, 2, and 3, are customizable, it's awesome. So this last guy over here, in terms of the clusters, this is the whole area autofocus, and the info button will determine whether the tracking box is enabled or disabled. Now, if it's disabled, you're not going to be able to see it. So we want this on enable. And the idea of this is that if you have a subject in here and you tap on it, is that it will track that subject, right? So we can engage the focusing. And the idea is that the camera will follow this wherever you go. Maybe we'll just do something different. There it goes. So it basically is saying that when we touch the screen, see if we can confuse it. Yeah, we can. Takes a second, and now it goes. We're basically telling the camera, hey, look for this shape and follow the shape around. Now, in the history of all the cameras that I've ever tested, which is a lot over 14 years, this tracking feature has never really worked perfectly for rapid sport shooting. But in cases of slower moving subject matter, it can really work. A lot of it depends on the amount of contrast and movement and subjects. Just keep that in mind. I think it's easier to pick a focusing square and ride with that, especially one of those new customizable size focusing clusters. One of these 3 guys, I really like those. So that is the basic of the where. So in summary, in terms of basic focusing for still shooting, the how, the when, and the where. How deals with how we engage the focusing systems, halfway shutter button depression or the AF on button, touching the monitor. The when deals with one shot or servo. And the where deals with how we're choosing our focusing squares. Now, there's other ways to get to our focusing squares. We can push the focusing cluster button directly. Then we push the MFN button, and here we are. So there are 2 button presses away, or you can go directly with the Q button if you want. Q. Sometimes it's easier to do it that way, but this other way looks like this. Cluster button, MFN button, and there we are. These are all the same clusters. Push MFN, toggle through them. This second method of pushing the cluster button and the MFN button is the preferred way to go as you are looking through the viewfinder. I want to talk about some of the secondary focusing options that we have. We have a beautiful model here. Thank you for stopping in. And this can be found in the Q menu under Subject to Detect. We're going to select People. We're going to set. We're also going to make sure that when we come in to the purple tab, we want to make absolutely sure that eye detection is turned on. If it's not turned on, this is not going to work. Eye detection essentially tells the camera to prioritize a human subject's face and to focus on one of the eyes. And that's what this is doing here. And you'll notice that even as I move the camera, regardless of where the focusing square is, that priority is going to revert back to a human's face. Now, this is a little confusing for it because it doesn't know whether you want to focus here or here. But in most cases, if you have a human face that it recognizes, it's going to prioritize there. Now, I can also say that this is size dependent, is that as you move further and further away from your subject, the camera has a harder time recognizing the facial pattern and it may not lock in. So you have to have a face of a certain size. But even as I move this focusing square, you can see that it's still tracking the eye over there. So in a case like this, if you were shooting a portrait with a single person, what I would recommend is just come in to your focusing clusters and choose a wider area. So now it's going to track that eye. If you know you're shooting a person with a camera. Another thing about this that is amazing is that when we're using a very wide aperture lens like 1.8 or 2.0 or even wider than that, is the camera does a fantastic job of nailing the focus so we don't have to recompose. And this has really been a game changer for mirrorless cameras. So if you are shooting people and you're having a hard time getting that focusing box to lock on, pick a larger area. You can even use maybe one of your custom flexible zones. See how it's staying within that zone there? It's looking for a face. And then when we get out of that zone, it may struggle a little bit more here and there. One of the questions that I often get is, how come I'm not nailing 100% focus on my eye detection? The truth of the matter is if you're getting 85 or higher percent, you're doing pretty good for your keepers, even with still subjects, is because shallow depths of field are a lot harder to focus. It's hard to get that focus lock. Now, having said that, coming back in, there are some other ways we can tweak this. I'm going to go to a large zone just for the sake of simplicity. Now you're going to see these arrows on the left and right. What that's asking is, do you want it to focus on the left or the right eye? You can see that I'm changing that with the joystick, and I'm not really getting that with a directional pad. So you can determine which eye you want it to focus on. And if there was another person in there, you could even tell which face that you want it to focus on. This is going to be more important, obviously, when you're shooting video. There's some tricks to making this work. Group photos, you're going to want to use a smaller aperture to get a deeper depth of field. We talk about a lot of this on the crash course. But eye detection is amazing when you are shooting portraits. Having said that, there are some other subject matters in here that we can select. Animals. So this is where it starts getting tricky, is because there are tens of thousands of different species of animals on planet Earth, and they all have different shapes to their faces. I think the algorithm is still learning and it's getting better, but this is going to have a much lower percentage of accuracy than something like a human's face when you're shooting an owl or a lizard or a snake. Those are three different faces. But if you're at the zoo, my understanding is this Canon is teaching the algorithm to detect facial patterns of certain animals. Again, it is size dependent. Something I want to warn you about is, do not have high expectations for animal eye detection. It depends on the animal, and you may not get even 80%. The algorithm will get better with time. Just keep that in mind. And now we even have vehicles where we can do spot detection or not. So this should be able to track cars, looking for windshields and things of that nature in vehicles, or we can turn it off altogether. When I turn it off, no more eye detection, and it's going back to the full zone. It's looking for an area of contrast, and it's finding the face. So that is eye detection for humans. In animals, make sure it's turned on in the menu on your purple tab, page 1, enable this. And then when we're dealing with the subject to detect, we want it to be on people, and then we get the eye detection. It makes our job as photographers so much easier. So the next thing I want to demonstrate is manual focus. I am going to select the manual focus switch on this lens. And as soon as I go into manual focus, it's giving me this distance marker from infinity to 0.45 meters. You can see the meter mark there. So the idea on this is that it is indicating where the focal plane is in meters. Now, I know it's kind of hard to see whether this is in focus or not, so I want to teach you a great technique that I use mostly when I'm doing video, and that is the zoom manual focus. What we do is we use the magnifying glass. That's at 5x, you can see. So I can visually see whether it's sharp or not, and if I wanted to zoom into 10x, I would push the magnifying glass again. And this is what I call manual zoom focusing. It allows us to get an up close look on what we are focusing on. I do it again a lot on video. And then we could shoot. We know what's in focus. We know that that's not going to change. The camera's not going to do anything funky. Most focusing on very high end filmmaking is all done manually, and they have somebody there who's adjusting the focus as they go. These cameras make it very easy for us to use some of these tools to get around that. So that is manual focus as well as manual zoom focus. I'm going to hit this switch back to autofocus, and I want to show you a couple other tools. They're in the autofocus purple tab, page 5, focus guide. This comes from some of Canon's video cameras. Here's how it works. To see it, you have to be in manual focus, so I'm flipping that switch back over. And you can see that we get these little triangles that as I rotate out of focus, you can see these triangles are not aligned. And as they come closer and closer together, when they line up and everything's good on the spot I'm focusing on, everything will turn green. So that is a different focusing tool that you can use. I'm going to come in and turn that off. That's called the focus guide. I think the manual zoom focus is more accurate. Here's another one, manual peaking settings. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to turn this to on. The level's high and the color is red. When this is on and you are in manual focus, I'm going to go back to autofocus and then back to manual focus. You can see that we get this red overlay on areas of high contrast that are in focus. So if I defocus, that overlay disappears. And as I refocus, that red overlay will appear again. And what it's doing is it's telling us when we have areas of high contrast, it puts this red pixelated color on it, right? Now we can come in here and change the colors if we wanted to go with, let's say, blue. There it is, it changes. And it doesn't work when we're zoomed in, something to keep in mind. But when we're zoomed out, it gives us a very nice contrasty layer of seeing where the camera is focusing. Defocus it, focus back in, and that is referred to as peaking focus.